Picture this. You're walking down the street on an ordinary afternoon when suddenly the sky darkens. A strange rumble echoes overhead, and before you can make sense of it, splash. Tiny, flapping shapes plummet from the clouds. Not rain, not hail, fish, hundreds of them, raining down as if the ocean itself turned upside down. This isn't a scene from a surreal dream or a science fiction movie. It's a real phenomenon that's left entire towns stunned, scientists scratching their heads, and witnesses wondering if they've stepped into some kind of bizarre alternate reality. Across the United States, reports of fish falling from the sky stretch back over a century, with each case more baffling than the last. Imagine stepping outside after a storm only to find your yard carpeted with slimy, wriggling creatures, no lakes or rivers for miles. These events aren't just freak accidents, they're full-blown meteorological mysteries that defy logic. Some blame tornadoes, others whisper about ancient legends or unexplained forces, but no single explanation fits every account. What we do know is that these stories are as strange as they are true, and today we're diving deep into the 33 weirdest, most mind-boggling cases in U.S. history. From a Louisiana town bombarded with hundreds of pounds of freshwater perch to a Texas parking lot suddenly transformed into an impromptu aquarium. These aren't just urban legends, they're documented events backed by newspaper clippings, eyewitness accounts, and even baffled weather experts. Some sound like pranks gone wrong, others like nature itself playing a twisted joke. But every single one leaves us with the same question: how does something this impossible keep happening? Buckle up, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about rain and the bizarre secrets hidden in the clouds above us. The truth, it's stranger than fiction. The summer of 1878 in eastern Kansas started like any other, hot, humid, and dotted with the occasional thunderstorm. But on one unforgettable afternoon, the small farming community of Hayes turned into the stage for one of nature's strangest performances. Without warning, the sky split open, not just with rain, but with living, wriggling creatures. Fishermen would have been thrilled if they weren't so utterly baffled. Dozens of reports flooded local newspapers, describing everything from sunfish to bullfrogs pelting rooftops, roads, and bewildered residents who ran for cover. One farmer claimed his field looked like a spilled tackle box, glistening with stranded fish flopping in the mud. The most chilling detail, these weren't just any fish. Witnesses identified species native to the Missouri River over 60 miles away. So how did they end up falling from the heavens? Scientists pointed to waterspouts, tornado-like whirlwinds that form over water, sucking up anything unlucky enough to swim near the surface. One theory suggested a massive spout had hoovered up an entire stretch of river, carrying its unlucky inhabitants high into the clouds before dumping them onto stunned Kansans. But here's the twist: no recorded storm that day matched the sheer power needed to lift that much weight. Even more puzzling, frogs fell alongside the fish, as if the sky had a grudge against amphibians too. To this day, skeptics argue it was a hoax, a prank gone viral in an era before the internet. But the sheer volume of first-hand accounts, many from respected farmers and even a local doctor, makes it hard to dismiss. The Kansas incident became the blueprint for every fish rain story that followed, leaving us with more questions than answers. If nature could pull a stunt like this once, what else was it capable of? It was just past noon in Minden, Louisiana, on a muggy September day in 1901 when the impossible happened. First came the wind, an unnatural gust that sent hats flying and rattled windows down Main Street. Then the sky seemed to split open with a sound like 1,000 wet slaps hitting the ground. Within minutes, the streets shimmered as if paved with silver, but it wasn't coins littering the road, it was fish. Hundreds of them, each about the length of a man's hand, their scales glinting in the sun as they twisted in the dust. Local newspapers called it a miracle of the modern age. though nobody felt particularly blessed scrubbing fish guts from their porches. Witnesses described the perch as fresh, even lively, some still flapping weakly in the gutters. The strangest detail, these weren't saltwater fish from the nearby Gulf, nor were they local to Minden's few ponds. They were white perch, a species common in the Great Lakes over 800 miles away. Scientists of the era scrambled for explanations. Some proposed a tornado had snatched them from a distant lake, carrying them across state lines before losing its grip. Others, more skeptical, accused traveling salesmen of dumping barrels of fish as a publicity stunt. But the sheer volume made that unlikely. We're talking enough perch to fill wagons, with reports coming from across town, not just one suspicious alleyway. A local butcher even claimed one fish smacked him square in the shoulder, leaving a scale stuck to his shirt like some bizarre badge of honor. The event made national headlines, with papers as far as New York debating whether it was divine intervention or just Mother Nature's idea of a practical joke. But for the people of Minden, the mystery never quite faded. Decades later, elderly residents would still point to the exact spot where fish rained like pennies from heaven, proof that sometimes reality is far weirder than any tall tale. Texarkana, Texas, was just waking up on a quiet morning in June 1918 when the sky turned odd. There was no storm, no dark clouds, just a sudden shift in the air, like the world holding its breath. Then came the unmistakable sound of wet thuds hitting rooftops and dirt roads. At first, folks thought it was an unusually heavy hailstorm until they looked closer. Catfish, dozens of them, not tiny fry but full-grown, whiskered catfish, some nearly a foot long, slapping onto porches and bouncing off wagons. They rained for a solid 3 minutes, turning streets into something out of a fever dream. One shopkeeper swore a fish landed square in his coffee cup, while a group of kids scrambled to collect the still flopping creatures in their hats, the strangest part. These weren't just any catfish, they were channel catfish, a species common in the nearby Red River. But the river was over 10 miles away, and there hadn't been a single storm that could explain how they'd gotten airborne. Now, Texans being Texans, the shock wore off fast. Once the initial confusion passed, practicality kicked in. Why let free food go to waste? Families hauled out buckets and baskets, gathering the unexpected bounty. Some fried them up for lunch that same day, joking that it was the only time the sky literally handed them dinner. Local papers ran tongue-in-cheek headlines like "Heaven's Fish Market opens early," but behind the humor was genuine bewilderment. Scientists later suggested a tornado over the river might have been the culprit, but records showed no twisters in the area that morning. Others whispered about wartime oddities. After all, this was the same year World War I ended, but no one could connect the dots. The event faded into local lore, surviving in grandparents' stories told over plates of well-fried catfish. To this day, no one knows for sure how those fish took flight, but one thing's certain: in Texas, even the weather knows how to make an entrance. Minneapolis residents were used to snow in December, but minnows. That's exactly what happened on a freezing afternoon in 1921, when the sky unleashed something far stranger than flurries. It started with a peculiar rustling noise, like someone shaking a giant bag of marbles overhead. Then came the downpour, thousands of tiny minnows, each no longer than a finger, raining onto icy sidewalks and snowbanks. They landed with soft plinks, some skittering across frozen puddles like living confetti. Within minutes, entire blocks were littered with silvery flashes, their gills still flaring as if desperate for water that wasn't there. Local meteorologists were stumped. Minnesota winters aren't exactly prime time for waterspouts, the usual suspect in fish rain cases, and there hadn't been a single reported tornado nearby. Even more baffling, these weren't random minnows. They were blunt-nosed minnows, a species common in the Mississippi River just a few miles away. But how did they get into the clouds? One theory suggested a freak gust might have swept them up from the river's surface, but the physics didn't add up. You'd need hurricane-force winds to lift that many fish that high, and the weather had been eerily calm all day. The event quickly became local legend, with kids sliding on fish-covered ice and housewives swapping theories over coffee. Newspapers, never ones to resist a pun, declared it the Great Minnow Storm of 21. Scientists quietly scribbled notes about aerosolized aquatic transfer, but the real kicker came weeks later when a farmer 30 miles north reported finding minnows in his field frozen solid mid-air, like tiny torpedoes launched from some unseen force. To this day, no one's cracked the case. Was it a meteorological glitch, a prank involving a low-flying airplane, the Mississippi's revenge? Whatever the truth, Minneapolis earned its place in fish rain history, proving that sometimes the weirdest weather doesn't come from the clouds but from the river below. The Dust Bowl had already turned Oklahoma into a land of nightmares by 1936, but even seasoned farmers weren't prepared for what fell from the sky that summer in Tulsa. It started like any other dust storm, a thick, choking haze rolling in from the west, turning noon into twilight. People huddled inside, covering their mouths with rags to keep out the grit. But then came the thuds, not the usual patter of dirt clumps or tumbleweeds. These were heavier, wetter. One man swore a 3-pound largemouth bass shattered his porch swing like a cannonball. Within minutes, the streets were littered with fish, dozens of them, some still gasping, their scales coated in red Oklahoma dirt. Witnesses described the surreal sight of bass flopping in dust drifts, their tails kicking up little clouds as if trying to swim through solid earth. The local sheriff, initially skeptical, arrived to find his deputies using fishing nets to clear the courthouse steps. Scientists later estimated the storm had dropped nearly 200 fish across a 3-block radius, all of them freshwater bass native to the Arkansas River 30 miles away. Now, dust storms lifting topsoil was one thing, but how do you explain fish flying through a dry whirlwind? Meteorologists pointed to the era's extreme weather whiplash. That same week, record heat had baked the region, while freak thunderstorms boiled up without warning. One theory suggested a microburst, a sudden downward blast of wind, might have scooped fish from a shallow stretch of the river, hurling them into the rotating dust storm like nature's own pitching machine. But even that didn't quite explain why only bass fell or how they survived the trip intact. For Dust Bowl survivors already battling crop failures and bankruptcy, the fish rain was either a cruel joke or a bizarre stroke of luck. Some families, desperate for protein, carried them home in grain sacks. Others saw it as an omen, a sign that the natural world had gone as off-kilter as the economy. Newspapers, always hungry for distractions from the Depression, ran headlines like "Dust to Dinner, Tulsa's Sky Served Buffet." But beneath the dark humor lay a chilling truth. If the weather could hurl fish across counties, what else might it do next? The event faded into local lore, overshadowed by the era's larger tragedies. Yet decades later, old-timers would still argue over whether those bass were a miracle or a warning, flukes of physics or flashes of something stranger lurking in the storm clouds. One thing's certain, in Oklahoma, even the dust storms came with teeth. The coastal town of Lompoc, California, was no stranger to odd marine events, but nothing could have prepared residents for the morning of July 5, 1947. Fishermen heading out at dawn were the first to notice something off. The air smelled saltier than usual, thick with an almost metallic tang. Then came the sound, a relentless pitter-patter that wasn't rain. Within minutes, the docks were slick with thousands of sardines, their silver bodies slapping against wood planks like hailstones. But this wasn't just a dockside oddity. The fish fell for nearly 20 minutes, blanketing rooftops, smacking windshields, even bouncing off umbrellas as confused cafe-goers scrambled for cover. Marine biologists rushed to the scene, expecting to find some logical explanation. These weren't just any sardines. They were Pacific sardines, a species that had once fueled California's booming canning industry before overfishing crashed their numbers. The irony wasn't lost on locals. Sardines had literally fallen from the sky in a town that hadn't seen a significant catch in years. Scientists initially pointed to a rare weather phenomenon called a water devil, a small but intense whirlwind capable of sucking fish from the ocean surface. But here's where the story gets slippery. The nearest sardine school had been tracked 12 miles offshore, too far for any ordinary whirlwind to carry them inland without dropping them at sea. Then there was the condition of the fish. Unlike most fish rain cases where specimens are battered or dead, these sardines were eerily intact, no broken scales, no signs of trauma. One biologist noted they looked as if they'd been carefully plucked from the water and placed by hand. This led to wilder theories, including the idea that a rogue wave or underwater landslide might have catapulted them skyward. Others whispered about secret military experiments. After all, this was the same year the term flying saucer entered the lexicon, but no records ever linked the two. The event made headlines nationwide, with papers dubbing it the miracle of the missing sardines. Cannery workers, half joking, brought nets to work the next day just in case. But the real impact was scientific. The incident forced marine researchers to reconsider how ocean currents interact with extreme weather. Years later, a team studying coastal wind patterns suggested a freak convergence of offshore winds might have created a natural fish cannon, channeling a concentrated stream of sardines inland like some bizarre aquatic conveyor belt. Lompoc's sardine shower remains a benchmark in fish rain lore, not just for its scale but for the questions it left unanswered. Why that species? Why that spot? And most hauntingly, if the ocean could cough up its secret so violently once, when might it happen again? For a town built on the sea's bounty, it was a reminder that nature's ledger always balanced in ways no one could predict. The children at Selma's elementary school were mid-recess when the first fish hit the slide with a wet smack. At first, the teachers thought it was a prank, maybe some kids tossing leftovers from a fishing trip. But then came the second fish and the third. By the time the playground erupted into equal parts chaos and delight, it was clear Alabama's skies had turned into an impromptu fisherman's net. The date was April 23, 1953, and Selma was about to earn its place in the annals of bizarre weather history with what locals still call the Great Crappie Cascade. These weren't just random fish. Crappie, a popular panfish with silvery speckled sides, began raining down in such numbers that students started filling their lunchboxes with them. One teacher described the surreal scene of kids dodging falling fish like something out of a cartoon, while janitors swept piles of them into trash bins. The strangest part, crappie are notoriously shy, usually hiding in deep underwater structures. For them to end up airborne defied logic. Scientists scrambled for explanations. The closest body of water, the Alabama River, was nearly 10 miles away, and weather reports showed no tornado activity that day. Some theorized a downburst, a sudden column of sinking air, might have vacuumed the fish from a hidden oxbow lake, but no such lake existed nearby. Even more baffling was the precision of the event. Fish fell almost exclusively over a 3-block radius centered on the school, as if the clouds had a grudge against algebra class. Locals, ever pragmatic, saw opportunity in the absurdity. By evening, backyard fish fries were in full swing, with neighbors joking about sky-caught specials. Newspapers, meanwhile, had a field day with one quipping, "Selma schools serve fish sticks straight from the source," but beneath the humor lurked genuine unease. If nature could target a playground with military precision, what did that mean for other so-called freak weather events? Decades later, the Crappie Cascade remains a fixture of Selma folklore, a story passed down with equal parts laughter and wonder. For scientists, it's a nagging outlier, a case where none of the usual explanations quite fit. But for those kids who lived through it, just another Alabama afternoon when the sky decided to go fishing and the whole town got caught in the net. Hurricane season in Florida always brings its share of oddities, but nothing could prepare Miami residents for the afternoon of September 8, 1956. The storm warnings had been up for hours, a typical late summer squall rolling in off the Atlantic. Then, amidst the horizontal sheets of rain, something far more alarming began slicing through the wind. Not branches, not debris, juvenile swordfish, some nearly 2 feet long, their needle-like snouts spearing into the sand like tiny harpoons. Beachgoers sprinting for cover describe the surreal sensation of fish whizzing past their heads, their sleek bodies catching the storm light like silver daggers. At first glance, you might assume a waterspout, those twisting marine tornadoes, was responsible. After all, they're the usual suspects in fish rain cases. But swordfish, these weren't tiny minnows or lightweight perch. Juvenile swordfish can weigh up to 10 pounds, with muscular bodies built for slicing through open ocean at blistering speeds. Lifting them requires forces far beyond typical waterspouts. Meteorologists examining weather data from that day hit another snag. While the hurricane's outer bands had indeed brushed Miami, no confirmed waterspouts were reported near the swordfish's known habitats. These fish typically cruise deep offshore, far beyond the reach of most storm systems. Theories spiraled. Some marine biologists suggested a freak fish tornado might have formed over the Gulf Stream, where warmer waters could supercharge a whirlwind's lifting power. Others pointed to the swordfish's unique physiology. Their streamlined shape might allow them to be carried farther once airborne, unlike bulkier species. But the most haunting detail came from local fishermen. They noted the juveniles weren't just any swordfish. Their size and markings suggested they'd been part of a single, tight-knit school. Whatever plucked them from the ocean had done so with terrifying precision, as if targeting that specific group. The event left scientists wrestling with uncomfortable questions. If a storm could yank predators that size from their habitat, what else might be lurking in the clouds? Hurricane researchers began revisiting old reports of other, large object rains, incidents where everything from eels to small sharks had reportedly fallen. Meanwhile, Miamians did what they do best, adapted. One restaurant owner famously served storm-caught swordfish specials for weeks, while beachcombers collected the needle-like snouts as macabre souvenirs. Decades later, the incident remains a benchmark in extreme weather studies, not just for its spectacle, but for the chilling reminder it offers. The ocean doesn't just give up its treasures gently. Sometimes it hurls them at us sword first. Portland's summer of 1961 was shaping up to be as mild and predictable as ever, until the afternoon of July 15th, when the sky decided to rewrite the rules of meteorology. It started with an odd darkness creeping over the city, not the usual storm clouds, but a thick, greenish haze that made streetlights flicker on at 3 in the afternoon. Then came the sound, a chorus of faint splashes like someone tossing pebbles into a pond, except the pond was downtown Portland. Office workers gawked as rainbow trout, each about the length of a forearm, began slapping onto sidewalks, bouncing off awnings, and even skidding across car hoods. The most surreal detail, these fish weren't just falling, they were fighting. Dozens of eyewitnesses swore the trout were still alive, their gills flaring as they writhed on hot pavement. A mail carrier named Harold Jenkins told reporters he'd watched one trout flip itself upright in a puddle, as if determined to swim through concrete. Local grocer Martha Ruiz famously scooped 3 into her apron and sprinted them to the Willamette River, only to realize the irony. She was returning fish to water that had apparently spat them out in the first place. Scientists descended on Portland, scrambling for explanations. The trout were identified as steelhead, a sea-run variety that should have been in the Columbia River miles away. The usual culprit, waterspouts, seemed unlikely. No major storms had been reported that day. One biologist floated the idea of a fish geyser, a theoretical phenomenon where shifting river currents could, under extreme pressure, shoot fish into the air. But even that couldn't explain why only steelhead fell or how they survived the journey. Locals, meanwhile, embraced the absurdity. A diner near Pioneer Square served cloud-caught trout specials for a week, while kids turned fish grabbing into an impromptu street game. The event even birthed a local saying, "Wait 5 minutes, the weather might serve dinner." But beneath the laughter lingered a genuine mystery. If trout could rain down alive, what else might be drifting unseen in the clouds? The Oregonian's front page headline put it best: "Portland's sky has a new catch of the day." Years later, retired meteorologists would cite the trout tempest as a turning point, the moment fish rains shifted from folklore to legitimate scientific puzzles. Yet for all the studies and theories, no one's ever fully explained how those steelhead took flight, or why they fought so hard to survive the fall. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be netted. Maybe, like the fish themselves, they're just passing through brief, dazzling, and utterly impossible to hold onto. Roswell, New Mexico, already had a reputation for strange skies by July 1969, but this time the mystery didn't come with little green men. It came with guppies, dozens of them, tiny and iridescent, plinking onto Main Street like living confetti one sweltering afternoon. At first, locals joked about alien aquariums bursting mid-flight. After all, this was the town forever linked to UFO lore, where even a stray weather balloon could spark conspiracy theories. But the truth, if you could call it that, was somehow both simpler and weirder. Witnesses described the guppies as healthy, their tails still flicking as they landed in puddles or stuck to sun-baked sidewalks. A diner waitress named Elena Martinez famously scooped a handful into her water glass, marveling at how their jewel-bright colors shimmered under the neon "hot coffee" sign. Unlike most fish rain cases, these weren't local species. Guppies are tropical fish native to South America, not the desert springs of New Mexico. So where did they come from? Enter the fish farms, just 20 miles outside Roswell. A cluster of commercial breeding ponds supplied pet stores across the Southwest. The theory seemed airtight. A rogue dust devil or microburst must have swept over the farms, hoovering up thousands of guppies before depositing them downtown. But here's the catch. Those farms mainly raised feeder fish, dull, hardy minnows. The Roswell guppies, however, were fancy varieties: cobras, mosaics, even rare delta tails worth $5 a piece in 1960s money. None of the nearby farms reported missing stock, let alone prize specimens. UFO enthusiasts naturally had a field day. Letters flooded local papers suggesting the guppies were biological probes or alien ecosystem tests. Even the sheriff's department got in on the fun, quipping that their cells now held the galaxy's tiniest illegal immigrants. Scientists, meanwhile, crunched the numbers. Lifting that many fish would require winds strong enough to flatten the farm's greenhouse roofs, yet no damage was reported. And why only guppies? If a whirlwind hit the ponds, why weren't there algae clumps, pondweed, or even a stray koi mixed in? The event faded into Roswell's lore, overshadowed by its flashier extraterrestrial reputation. But for biologists, it remains a head-scratcher. Maybe a private collector's aquarium got caught in a freak gust. Maybe a passing truck carrying exotic fish lost its cargo in just the right or wrong meteorological moment. Or maybe, as one retired farmer put it, the desert's just thirsty for weirdness sometimes. Whatever the truth, Roswell's guppy gale proved one thing. In a town where the sky's never just the sky, even the fish come with a side of mystery. Anchorage residents knew their weather could be extreme, but nothing prepared them for the afternoon of August 3, 1972, when the sky started dropping salmon. Not just a few stray fish, mind you. Dozens of full-grown sockeye salmon, each weighing 6 to 8 pounds, began thudding onto parking lots, bouncing off cars, and even crashing through a Sears store's skylight like some bizarre airborne seafood delivery. The scene was equal parts spectacle and hazard, with pedestrians ducking under awnings as the fish rained down in sporadic bursts for nearly 15 minutes. Now, salmon in Alaska aren't exactly rare, but they're supposed to stay in the water, specifically in nearby Ship Creek, where thousands were making their annual spawning run just a few blocks from downtown. At first glance, the explanation seemed obvious. A freak waterspout or tornado must have plucked them from the creek and hurled them skyward. But here's where the story gets slippery. Meteorologists confirmed no tornado activity that day, and waterspouts, those twisting marine whirlwinds, typically form over open water, not narrow urban rivers. Even more puzzling, these weren't just any salmon. They were all mature sockeye, bright red and ready to spawn, their bodies packed with the energy needed to swim upstream. How could a weather event selectively target only fish at that exact life stage? Eyewitness accounts added layers to the mystery. A construction worker near the federal building swore he saw fish tumbling sideways like they'd been thrown, while a taxi driver described hearing a strange whistling noise before each fish landed, almost as if they'd been launched, not dropped. Biologists who examined the fish later noted something even stranger. Their gills were clogged with a fine, chalky dust, unlike the clean silt of Ship Creek. Some speculated the salmon had been scooped from much farther away, perhaps even a tributary miles upstream, then carried aloft by a wind current no one had tracked. The event left Anchorage buzzing with theories. Fishermen joked about the world's worst fishing trip. Didn't even need a rod, just a hard hat. Scientists, meanwhile, quietly added it to a growing file of selective fish rains, cases where only one species, or even one life stage of a species, fell from the sky. For locals, though, the real surprise came weeks later, when reports trickled in of bears acting strangely near the city's outskirts. Normally, the animals would have been knee-deep in Ship Creek by then, feasting on spawning salmon. This year, they barely showed up. As one wildlife ranger put it, "Guess even the bears got takeout." To this day, the Anchorage salmon squall defies easy explanation. Was it a fluke of wind patterns no one predicted, a bizarre side effect of that year's record-breaking salmon run, or something else entirely, a reminder that in Alaska, nature doesn't just follow the rules. Sometimes it rewrites them midair. Chicago had seen its share of bizarre aquatic events. The annual green dyeing of the river for St. Patrick's Day was practically a civic tradition. But nothing could have prepared the city for the morning of May 12, 1977, when the sky opened up with something far stranger than emerald water. Carp, not the decorative koi kind you'd find in a garden pond, but full-grown common carp, some weighing over 15 pounds, slamming into sidewalks along the magnificent mile like slippery, scaled anvils. Office workers sprinting for cover described the surreal sight of fish bouncing off taxis, their whiskered mouths gaping as if equally shocked by their sudden relocation from river to rooftop. The irony wasn't lost on locals. Just weeks earlier, the Chicago River had been intentionally dyed bright green for the city's iconic celebration, a spectacle drawing crowds from across the country. Now, nature seemed to be staging its own twisted sequel, Chicago's second fishy invasion, as the Tribune quipped, but this was no publicity stunt. These were wild carp, their thick, golden scales caked with mud from the Illinois River nearly 60 miles southwest. Scientists initially pointed to a supercell thunderstorm that had ripped through the region overnight, theorizing its downdrafts might have vacuumed fish from shallow backwaters. Yet weather radar showed no tornado activity strong enough to lift fish that size, not without also hurling tree branches or debris, neither of which rained down that day. The scene bordered on absurdity. A parking attendant near the Wrigley building spent his lunch break prying a carp from a windshield wiper, while a hot dog vendor improvised by grilling a few sky-caught specials, later confirming they tasted just as muddy as the river ones. But beneath the laughs lurked a genuine meteorological puzzle. These carp weren't just heavy, they were deep water dwellers, rarely venturing near the surface where winds could snatch them. Even more baffling, they fell in a tight corridor along the lakeshore, avoiding residential areas entirely. One hydrologist likened it to someone tilting a giant fish tank over downtown with perfect aim. Decades later, the carp cloudburst remains a favorite Windy City tall tale, trotted out whenever conversation lags at dive bars or Cubs games. Scientists, meanwhile, still reference it as a textbook example of selective advection, or weather's ability to cherry-pick objects from one location and deposit them miles away with eerie precision. Whether it was a fluke of fluid dynamics or just Lake Michigan's idea of a practical joke, one thing's certain: in Chicago, even the weather knows how to make a splash. And next to fish falling like feathered bowling balls, suddenly green rivers seemed downright tame. Las Vegas in 1983 was used to spectacles, neon lights, slot machine jackpots, Elvis impersonators. But on the afternoon of July 22nd, the Strip witnessed its strangest act yet, a desert downpour of fish. Not the glittering showgirl kind, but actual, flapping tilapia raining onto casino roofs and pool decks. Visitors lounging at the dune's oasis-like pool suddenly found themselves dodging silver-scaled projectiles, while blackjack dealers at Caesar's Palace paused mid-shuffle as fish plopped onto felt tables like some surreal high-roller bonus. This wasn't just bizarre, it was biologically implausible. Nevada averages less than 5 inches of rain annually, and tilapia are tropical fish native to Africa's warm rivers, not the Mojave's cracked earth. The most logical theory pointed to monsoonal winds, which that summer had whipped north from Mexico's Gulf of California, where tilapia farms dotted the coastline. Meteorologists suggested a microburst, a sudden, powerful downdraft might have vacuumed up thousands of fish from shallow breeding ponds, carrying them 200 miles across the Sonoran Desert before losing its grip over Vegas. But the details didn't quite add up. First, the fish were too fresh. Tilapia can't survive more than a few hours out of water, yet these were still twitching when they landed. Second, weather satellites showed no storm cells strong enough to lift that much biomass, and strangest of all, the tilapia were all nearly identical in size, about 6 inches long, as if someone had calibrated nature's fish cannon for uniformity. Locals, ever quick to capitalize on weirdness, hosted impromptu desert sushi parties, while casino bosses joked about adding fish rain to their betting boards. Scientists, though, were haunted by the implications. If wind could carry living organisms hundreds of miles inland, what else might be drifting unseen over cities? The event even inspired a short-lived conspiracy theory that the fish were government-engineered, dumped to test biological dispersal methods, a claim debunked when tilapia bones turned up in coyote scat weeks later. In the end, Vegas being Vegas, the tilapia tempest became just another footnote in its endless parade of oddities. But for meteorologists, it remains a textbook case of nature's refusal to play by the rules. After all, in a city built on defying odds, maybe fish raining from a cloudless sky was the universe's way of saying, the house always wins even when the house is the sky itself. Honolulu's beaches are known for rainbows, not fish falling from them, but on an otherwise ordinary morning in March 1986, tourists at Waikiki got both. The first sign something was off came when sunbathers noticed dark streaks high in the cloudless sky, like someone had dragged a paintbrush across the blue. Then the splashes started, tiny at first, then louder, as if the ocean had been flipped upside down. Within minutes, the sand was littered with darting shapes in neon yellows and electric blues, reef fish. Butterfly fish, triggerfish, even a few tiny yellow tang species that should have been darting between coral heads offshore, not plummeting onto beach towels. Marine biologists rushed to the scene, kneeling in the sand to inspect fish still flapping weakly under the tropical sun. The discovery raised more questions than answers. These weren't just any reef dwellers, they were pelagic juveniles, young fish that spend their earliest weeks drifting in open ocean currents before settling onto reefs. That meant they'd likely been plucked from the sea's surface, not the seafloor, but but how Hawaii's waters are deep, with reefs often miles from shore. Even the most powerful waterspouts, those spinning columns of air that suck up surface water, typically drop their cargo within a few hundred yards. Yet these fish had traveled horizontally for miles without a single storm in sight. The most compelling theory came from an unlikely source, a commercial airline pilot who'd been descending into Honolulu that morning. He reported seeing an odd, narrow funnel over the ocean, not a classic waterspout, but what meteorologists call a steam devil, a rare, heat-driven whirlwind that forms over warm water without an associated storm. Unlike typical waterspouts, steam devils can stretch higher into the atmosphere, acting like elevators for lightweight objects. One researcher later calculated that if such a vortex had skimmed a shoal of larval fish near the surface, it could have carried them to the altitude of passing trade winds, which then ferried them inland like a bizarre aerial conveyor belt. But the mystery deepened when divers surveyed nearby reefs days later. Normally, losing hundreds of juvenile fish would leave noticeable gaps in the ecosystem. Yet coral colonies showed no signs of disturbance and fish counts were strangely normal. This led to a haunting possibility. Maybe the fish hadn't come from nearby at all. Oceanographers pointed to the North Equatorial Current, a massive flow that carries marine life from as far as the Philippines toward Hawaii. Could a freak whirlwind have plucked these fish weeks earlier, somewhere in the remote Pacific, holding them suspended in clouds until the winds shifted? Waikiki's Beach Boys, ever pragmatic, turned the event into legend. For years afterward, they jokingly warned tourists to watch for falling fish on humid mornings. Scientists, meanwhile, quietly added it to a growing dossier of marine mysteries, proof that the ocean's connection to the sky was far stranger than any textbook dared suggest. If a steam devil could turn reef fish into living rain, what other invisible highways existed between sea and land? The answer, it seemed, was blowing in the wind along with the occasional bewildered tang. Little Rock, Arkansas, was no stranger to summer storms, but the one that rolled in on the evening of June 7, 1989, brought more than thunder and lightning. It brought dinner violently. Residents hunkered down as the sky turned an eerie shade of green, the kind that makes even seasoned storm chasers pause. Then came the sound, not just the familiar crack of lightning, but a wet, slapping chorus as catfish, dozens of them, some nearly 2 feet long, began smacking into rooftops and streets like scaly hailstones. What made this fish rain different wasn't just the sheer size of the catfish, though their whiskered faces and thick bodies made for a surreal sight bouncing off parked cars. It was the lightning. Multiple witnesses reported fish literally cooking midair, their skins charring as bolts struck nearby, filling the air with the acrid scent of fried catfish. One firefighter described finding a smoldering specimen on the hood of his truck, its flesh flaking apart like it had been grilled over an invisible flame. Local news stations, unable to resist, ran headlines like "Storm serves up blackened specials." Scientists were quick to theorize. The catfish matched species from the Arkansas River, less than 5 miles away, and weather radar confirmed a supercell with rotating updrafts capable of lifting heavy objects. But the lightning interaction stumped even seasoned meteorologists. Fish are poor conductors, making it unlikely they'd attract strikes. Yet multiple charred carcasses were found clustered near lightning-scorched trees. One researcher proposed the fish might have acted as accidental conductors if they'd been coated in river silt, creating a makeshift path for electricity. Others wondered if the sheer density of falling fish momentarily altered the storm's electrical field, turning the sky into a macabre deep fryer. Locals, ever pragmatic, saw opportunity in the chaos. By dawn, impromptu fish fries popped up across town, with neighbors swapping stories over plates of storm-battered catfish. But the event left a deeper mark on Little Rock's collective memory. For years afterward, old-timers would point to specific patches of sidewalk, claiming you could still smell burnt scales on humid summer nights. And for meteorologists, the Arkansas catfish cyclone became a case study in how even the wildest weather theories sometimes aren't wild enough. After all, if a storm could turn fish into lightning rods, what other surreal possibilities were lurking in the clouds? The answer, it seemed, was written in the scorch marks and the lingering aroma of an accidental barbecue. St. Louis had seen its share of snowstorms by January 1994, but nothing like the blizzard that rolled in on the 19th. At first, it seemed routine: gray skies, biting winds, the usual Midwestern winter misery. Then came the thuds, not the soft patter of snowflakes, but heavy, wet impacts that sent dogs barking and kids scrambling to windows. The streets weren't turning white, they were turning silver, littered with flipping, gasping bluegill, their iridescent scales glinting against the slush like scattered coins. This wasn't just fish falling from the sky, it was fish falling with the sky. Witnesses described snowflakes and bluegill tumbling together, as if the clouds couldn't decide between precipitation genres. A mailman named Carl Riggs famously told the Post-Dispatch he'd watched a fish slide down a power line, like some kind of demented holiday decoration, while a group of seminary students built a snowman with a bluegill wedged where the nose should have been. The scene was absurd enough to make locals question their sanity, but the proof was everywhere: fish embedded in snowbanks, fish frozen to car antennas, even a few lodged in the wrought iron fences of Forest Park like some bizarre aquatic art installation. Now, bluegill rains might sound like a novelty, but in Missouri, they tapped into something deeper, an old Ozark folklore about snowing fish. Older generations whispered that when fish fell with snow, it meant the river spirits were unsettled, tossing their bounty back at the land. Some farmers even took it as an omen, spreading the fish in their fields as fertilizer, convinced they carried a strange kind of luck. Scientists, of course, had other ideas. The bluegill matched species from the Mississippi River, less than 10 miles east, and weather maps showed a rare snow squall vortex forming over the river that morning, a mini tornado capable of hoisting fish into the storm system. But here's the twist: bluegill are bottom dwellers. They don't school near the surface like perch or shad, making them unlikely candidates for aerial abduction. Theories piled up like the snow itself. One hydrologist suggested the vortex had dredged them from deep river eddies, while a folklorist argued the fish were winter-starved and had risen unnaturally close to the ice-covered surface. The truth, nobody really knew. Even the National Weather Service's official report included the phrase "atmospheric anomaly" 7 times without further explanation. By afternoon, the story had gone national, with late-night hosts joking about St. Louis's new catch and release blizzard policy. But the real legacy of the bluegill blizzard wasn't the spectacle, it was the way it blurred lines between science and myth. For centuries, cultures worldwide had stories of snowing fish, from Norway's Fiskesno legends to Tibetan monks who considered them celestial gifts. Modern meteorology might dismiss them as waterspouts or wind shear, but standing there that day, watching bluegill spiral down like some bizarre mix of hail and confetti, it was hard not to wonder, what if the old tales got it half right? Maybe nature doesn't just follow rules, maybe it remixes them, turning river fish into snowflakes just to remind us how little we truly understand. In the end, the fish melted into memory as quickly as the snow. But ask any St. Louisan who lived through it, and they'll swear on a stack of almanacs. The winter of '94 was the year the sky forgot how to sky and taught them all to expect the impossible. Seattle's drizzly reputation took a surreal turn on the morning of October 9, 1997, when commuters in the Capitol Hill neighborhood witnessed something far stranger than rain dripping from their umbrellas. Jellyfish, tiny, translucent moon jellies no bigger than silver dollars, began plopping onto sidewalks, their delicate bells shattering on impact like living glass ornaments. At first, people assumed they were bizarre Halloween decorations, until they noticed the tendrils still twitching. Now, fish rains are one thing, but jellyfish. These creatures are 95% water, with no bones, no scales, just gossamer thin membranes barely sturdy enough to survive a wave's crash, let alone a free fall from the troposphere. Marine biologists rushed to collect samples, their disbelief growing as they confirmed the identification. Moon jellies Aurelia aurita are common in Puget Sound, but they're coastal drifters pulsing lazily just below the surface. For them to end up airborne defied every known law of biomechanics. The prevailing theory pointed to a freak combination of weather systems. That morning, a strong low-pressure cell had collided with an offshore wind shear, creating a vertical draft powerful enough to theoretically suction jellyfish from the Sound's surface. But here's where the science gets slippery. Jellies don't swim in schools like fish, they're solitary, scattered. To lift enough of them to carpet several blocks would require a vortex with surgical precision. Even more baffling, moon jellies are fragile. Expose them to air for more than a few minutes and their cells collapse like deflated balloons. Yet witnesses reported some jellies still pulsating weakly after landing, as if they'd fallen through some kind of atmospheric cushion. Skeptics proposed alternative explanations. A ruptured aquarium truck, unlikely. No local suppliers reported missing stock. A college prank, the sheer volume ruled that out. Then came the kicker. Satellite imagery revealed a massive jellyfish bloom in the Sound that week, with densities so high they tinted the water milky blue. Some oceanographers suggested the wind might have skimmed the surface like a spoon through soup, ladling jellies into the updraft. But even that didn't fully explain how such delicate creatures survived the journey intact. The event sparked fierce debate among marine scientists. Could gelatinous organisms actually evolve to exploit wind currents like oceanic dandelion seeds? One controversial paper proposed that jellyfish mucus might form a temporary protective cocoon in midair, a theory met with equal parts fascination and eye rolls. Meanwhile, Cetulites embraced the absurdity. Coffee shops served jellyfish latte specials sans actual jellies, while local artists crafted chandeliers from resin-cast replicas. Years later, the Washington jellyfish jolt remains a stubborn outlier in meteorological records, a reminder that the ocean's relationship with the sky might be far more fluid than we think. If something as fragile as a jellyfish can hitch a ride on the wind, what other impossibilities are drifting overhead, unseen? The answer, much like the jellies themselves, seems to dissolve the moment you try to grasp it. Atlanta's spring of 2000 was already shaping up to be one for the record books. Torrential rains had swollen the Chattahoochee River to flood stage, turning parks into ponds and backyards into swamps. But on the night of April 12th, the weather decided to escalate from inconvenient to outright surreal. As thunderstorms rumbled over the northern suburbs, residents of Sandy Springs reported something far stranger than rain pelting their rooftops. It sounded like wet gravel hitting pavement, except the gravel was alive. Shadfish, hundreds of them, each about the length of a dinner plate, were tumbling from the sky, their silvery bodies slapping against driveways and sliding down windshields with a sound one witness compared to God emptying his coin purse. Now, shad aren't just any fish. These were American shad, a species famous for their grueling spring migrations up coastal rivers to spawn. The timing was eerily precise. The fish had been massing in the Chattahoochee by the thousands, their annual run peaking just as the floods hit. Meteorologists later pieced together a chain of events so bizarre it bordered on poetic. That evening, a supercell thunderstorm had spawned a weak tornado near Roswell, just enough of a twister to dip its fingers into the river's swollen overflow channels. Witnesses described a dark, churning column, dancing along the water's edge for mere seconds before vanishing. In that brief window, it apparently vacuumed up an entire school of shad mid-migration, carrying them aloft like some biblical-scale fishing net before the storm's downdrafts dumped them 5 miles inland. The evidence was irrefutable. fish found in Sandy Springs matched the size and species of those battling upstream that week, their gills still clogged with river sediment. But here's the twist: shad are notoriously fragile. They die quickly out of water, yet many were still flapping when they landed. Hydrologists crunched the numbers. Those fish had been airborne for roughly 12 minutes, far longer than typical fish rain events. The only explanation: the tornado must have lifted them into an unusually stable updraft, a kind of atmospheric holding pattern that kept them suspended just long enough to ride the storm inland without asphyxiating. Locals, ever resourceful, turned catastrophe into comedy. One family strung up a shad kebab sign over their grill, while a middle school science teacher collected specimens for dissections, quipping, "When the sky hands you lesson plans, you don't ask questions." But for scientists, the event was a gold mine. It offered rare proof that even weak tornadoes could transport live organisms farther than previously thought. A revelation with implications for everything from invasive species to disease transmission. The Georgia shad shower faded into local lore, but its legacy lingers. Next time you hear about floods or twisters, remember, sometimes nature doesn't just move water. It moves what's in the water right onto your front lawn. Sioux Falls was still shaking off winter's chill on that overcast April morning in 2003, when nature decided to flip the script on what spring showers could mean. The rain started normally enough, heavy drops splattering against sidewalks still damp from melted snow. But then came the thuds, not the muffled patter of water, but solid, meaty impacts that sent dogs yelping and kids ducking under porches. Within minutes, the streets of downtown looked like the aftermath of some deranged ice fisherman's revenge fantasy. Dozens of northern pike, each 2 to 3 feet long, their toothy mouths gaping as they skidded across asphalt and lawn chairs alike. These weren't just any fish. Northern pike are apex predators, muscular, aggressive, and built like underwater missiles. Finding them sprawled across parking lots was like stumbling onto a scene from a horror movie where the monsters fell from the sky. One office worker famously told the Argus leader she'd watched a pike spear straight through a convertible's fabric top, its dorsal fin snagged in the canvas like some kind of redneck hood ornament. Grocery store clerks battled pike sliding across freshly mopped floors, while a group of teenagers turned the event into an impromptu wrestling match, daring each other to grab the still thrashing fish by their infamous razor-sharp gill plates. Scientists scrambled for explanations. Pike are native to nearby Lake Alvin, but the lake was over 15 miles away, far beyond the usual range of waterspouts or tornadoes. Weather records showed no severe storms that morning, just steady rain. Even more baffling, every single pike was an adult, identical in size, as if the sky had a vendetta against fish born in the same year. Biologists who examined them found their stomachs empty, ruling out the possibility they'd been scooped up mid-meal. But for the Lakota Sioux tribes of the region, the event carried echoes of something older. Oral traditions speak of Wakinyan, the thunder beings, who are said to ride storm clouds and occasionally hurl gifts or warnings from the skies. Some elders interpreted the pike rain as a modern manifestation of an old legend about Heyoka, sacred tricksters who disrupt the natural order to teach humility. One tribal historian pointed to centuries-old ledger drawings depicting fish falling onto tipis, suggesting such events might have occurred long before modern meteorology tried to explain them. Theories collided like weather fronts. Perhaps a rare, downburst wind had scoured Lake Alvin's shallows where pike congregate to spawn. Maybe a rogue pressure system created a temporary fish elevator, lifting them high enough to be carried inland. But no single explanation could account for the precision how only pike fell, how none showed signs of trauma, or why they landed in such a concentrated area. By afternoon, Sioux Falls had embraced the absurdity. Restaurants offered sky pike specials, while local artists welded scrap metal into fish shaped where the veins pointed ominously downward. Yet beneath the jokes lingered a deeper question. If the past and present could collide so violently, if science and legend both failed to fully explain this, what other surprises might the clouds still hold? For the Lakota, the answer was simple. Sometimes the sky doesn't just speak, it throws things, and that day what it threw was 30 pounds of angry, flopping pike per square block, a reminder that nature's sense of humor is as sharp as a predator's teeth. Phoenix residents were used to dust storms, those swirling brown monsters locals called haboobs, but nothing prepared them for the sky's surprise delivery on August 4, 2006. The monsoon had been brutal that summer, with thunderstorms rolling in like clockwork every afternoon. But on this particular day, the storm brought more than just rain and lightning. As the winds whipped through downtown, people started noticing odd, silvery shapes tumbling in the gusts. Then came the splats, hundreds of tilapia, some still flipping wildly, slapping onto scorching pavement and bouncing off car hoods like some kind of desert-themed pinball game. Now, finding fish in the desert is strange enough, but these weren't just any fish. These were Nile tilapia, a species native to Africa's tropical rivers, about as far from Arizona's arid landscape as you could get. The mystery deepened when biologists identified them as farm-raised stock, their stunted growth and uniform size pointing to an aquaculture origin, the closest tilapia farms. Nearly 50 miles south near the Gila River. So how did they end up plastered across downtown Phoenix like some bizarre seafood airmail? Meteorologists traced the storm's path with forensic precision. That afternoon, a microburst, a sudden, violent downdraft, had ripped through a cluster of fish farms near Casa Grande, lifting thousands of tilapia from their overcrowded ponds. But here's where the math gets fuzzy. Tilapia aren't lightweight. A 6-inch specimen weighs roughly half a pound, and eyewitnesses reported fish closer to 8 inches long. For winds to carry them 50 miles north, they'd need sustained speeds of over 80 miles per hour, far stronger than anything recorded that day. Even more puzzling. The fish fell in a tight corridor along the storm's leading edge, avoiding surrounding neighborhoods entirely. One researcher compared it to a sniper shot from the sky. Locals reacted with classic Southwestern pragmatism. Construction workers used hard hats as makeshift buckets, collecting fish for after-work barbecues, while a downtown sushi chef, never one to waste free ingredients, famously rolled a limited edition storm catch roll. But scientists weren't laughing. The event forced a reevaluation of monsoon mechanics, particularly how microbursts interact with agricultural sites. One theory suggested the fish pond's warm water supercharged the downdraft, creating a localized vortex strong enough to launch tilapia like living projectiles. Another pointed to the farm's dense stocking practices. Overcrowded ponds meant more fish near the surface, ripe for plucking. The Arizona tilapia twister became a case study in extreme weather's ability to rewrite ecological rules. If desert winds could transplant tropical fish across counties, what else might be drifting unseen in those dust-filled gusts? For Phoenix residents, the answer came with every monsoon thereafter, a lingering joke, sure, but also a silent question every time the skies darkened: what's for dinner? Nashville's Broadway was already slick with neon and honky-tonk sweat on that muggy July night in 2009, but no one expected the sky to add its own brand of slime to the mix. It started around midnight, just as the last guitar chords were fading from the bars, a sudden, greasy downpour that had tourists ducking under awnings and laughing at their bad luck. Then the laughter turned to shrieks as the rain started wriggling. Eels, dozens of them, each about as thick as a garden hose and just as slippery, came slapping onto the pavement like living spaghetti dumped from the heavens. These weren't just any eels, they were American eels, snake-like, nocturnal creatures that spend most of their lives hiding in river mud. Now, suddenly, they were thrashing across Music City's most famous street, their slick bodies glistening under streetlights as they tried in vain to slither back toward water that wasn't there. One bouncer at Tootsie's Orchid Lounge later described the scene as like someone tipped over a bucket of nightmare noodles, while a group of drunk college kids attempted to lasso a particularly feisty specimen with a belt. The chaos escalated quickly. Eels slithered into open guitar cases, coiled around parking meters, and even plopped onto the hood of a slowly moving tour bus, where one passenger screamed loud enough to rival the Grand Ole Opry. The most bizarre detail, these eels were all roughly the same size, about 18 inches long, as if the sky had a very specific eel quota to fill. Scientists later matched them to the Cumberland River's population, just a few blocks away, but the how of their aerial journey stumped even seasoned meteorologists. Here's where the mystery deepens. American eels are bottom dwellers, notorious for burrowing into riverbeds during the day. For a storm to scoop them up, it would have needed to dredge the Cumberland's deepest, muddiest stretches with surgical precision. Weather reports showed no tornadoes or waterspouts that night, just a typical summer thunderstorm. But locals who'd fished those waters for decades pointed out something eerie. Eels are strong. Their muscular bodies can survive out of water for hours, and they're infamous for escaping buckets, coolers, even nets. Had some primal instinct kicked in mid-flight, sending them writhing with enough force to stay airborne longer than physics should allow. The aftermath was equal parts comedy and carnage. By dawn, cleanup crews were scraping eel guts off boot scooting floors, while biologists scrambled to preserve specimens before the summer sun turned them into jerky. Meanwhile, Nashville songwriters, never ones to waste good material, were already workshopping lyrics about eels on my windshield and love slicker than a sky slithering snake. But beneath the laughter lurked a genuine scientific conundrum. If a routine storm could turn eels into projectiles, what other river creatures might be capable of unexpected aerial acrobatics? The answer, it seemed, was written in the slime trails leading back to the Cumberland, a reminder that even in the age of radar and satellites, nature still has a few bars left to sing off-key. Louisville residents were just settling into a lazy Sunday afternoon in May 2011 when the sky turned into an impromptu pet store. One minute, kids were playing tag in Shawnee Park. The next, they were dodging tiny orange projectiles plopping onto the grass like some kind of deranged carnival game. Goldfish, not just a few strays, but hundreds of them, each no bigger than a thumb, their scales flashing in the sunlight as they tumbled onto sidewalks and rooftops. At first, people thought it was a prank, maybe some overzealous birthday party gone wrong, until the sheer volume made it clear. This was nature's idea of a free giveaway. Now, fish rains are bizarre enough, but goldfish, these weren't wild river species. They were the classic pet shop variety, the kind you win at county fairs in plastic bags. Their bright orange bodies stood out against the pavement like scattered pennies, and their sudden appearance sparked instant pandemonium. Kids scrambled to stuff them into water bottles and lunchboxes, while parents debated whether the sky had just handed them an unexpected responsibility. One man told local news he'd watched a goldfish land perfectly in his coffee cup, bobbing to the surface with what he swore was a look of pure betrayal. Scientists were less amused. Goldfish are invasive when released into local waterways, and the thought of hundreds surviving the fall and potentially making it to nearby ponds sent biologists into a frenzy. Theories flew faster than the fish had fallen. The most plausible, a rogue whirlwind had skimmed the surface of a nearby breeding pond at just the wrong moment. Private goldfish farms dot the Kentucky countryside, their shallow outdoor pools ripe for atmospheric plundering. But here's the hitch: goldfish are dense. Lifting them requires winds strong enough to uproot trees, yet Louisville's weather log showed barely a breeze that day. Then came the avian angle. One retired ornithologist floated the idea that herons or cormorants, birds notorious for stealing fish, might have panicked mid-flight, dropping their loot en masse. It wouldn't be the first time birds rained prey. Seagulls have been known to release clams onto parking lots to crack them open, but goldfish inland. And why all at once? The theory dissolved faster than a fish flake in water. The real kicker: a week later, a farmer 30 miles north reported finding a single, very confused koi in his soybean field, a fish that definitely hadn't been there before. Had the same event carried it farther, or was the sky just warming up for round two? Louisville never got its answer, but to this day, Shawnee Park regulars still glance upward when the clouds gather, half expecting a sequel to what locals now call the Great Goldfish Giveaway. Because if there's one thing nature loves more than a good mystery, it's a punchline, and that day, Louisville was the butt of the joke, a very wet, very orange joke. Boston's Seaport District was bustling on that crisp October morning in 2013, tourists snapping photos of the harbor, office workers clutching overpriced coffees, fishermen unloading their pre-dawn catches. Then at precisely 9:42 a.m., the sky turned traitor. 1 second it was all crisp autumn sunlight, the next a sound like 1,000 wet newspapers slapping pavement. Mackerel, Atlantic mackerel, to be exact, hundreds of them, their blue-green stripes flashing like some deranged meteor shower as they torpedoed onto sidewalks, bounced off parked cars, and even shattered a cafe's patio umbrella with the force of their descent. At first, the assumption was simple: a fishing boat must have capsized nearby, spilling its haul into the harbor. But then the math didn't add up. These mackerel weren't washing ashore. They were falling vertically, as if the clouds had morphed into some nightmarish sushi conveyor belt. Witnesses described fish hitting the ground with enough force to crack their skulls open, their silver bellies bursting on impact. A seafood distributor named Marty Finnegan, who'd spent 30 years on the docks, told reporters it was like God got bored and started playing Fruit Ninja with the whole damn harbor. Theories erupted faster than the fish had fallen. The Coast Guard scrambled to check local fishing vessels, but no spills were reported, just a handful of confused captains staring at radars that showed nothing out of the ordinary. Meteorologists, meanwhile, were flummoxed. Boston Harbor's waters are deep, and mackerel typically school far below the surface where winds can't reach them. Even a waterspout, the usual suspect in fish rain cases, would struggle to yank them up without also sucking in jellyfish, seaweed, or at least a few disgruntled lobsters. But the seaport streets were suspiciously free of marine debris. Just mackerel, lots and lots of mackerel. Then came the conspiracy angle. A local marine biologist pointed out that Atlantic mackerel populations had crashed that year due to overfishing, leading to strict quotas. Could someone have dumped an illegal catch mid-harbor, only for a freak gust to redistribute it onto land? Fishermen scoffed at the idea. No one would waste valuable mackerel, quotas or not. Others whispered about military experiments, citing a nearby naval base's history of atmospheric research. But the most unsettling detail came from a group of whale watchers who'd been on the water that morning. They swore they'd seen a massive flock of gulls acting strangely, like they'd dropped something heavy mid-flight. Boston being Boston, the event quickly took on a life of its own. Chefs at Legal Seafoods joked about sky sushi specials, while city workers grumbled through the fishy cleanup. But for scientists, the Massachusetts mackerel mayhem was more than just a weird weather blip. It forced a re-evaluation of how wind interacts with dense schools of fish, particularly in urban harbors where microclimates can create bizarre localized effects. One study later suggested the mackerel might have been pushed to the surface by a pod of feeding dolphins, only to get caught in a sudden wind tunnel effect between high rises, a phenomenon usually reserved for paper debris, not 2-pound fish. The truth we may never know for sure, but next time you stroll through Boston Seaport, glance up. Those aren't just seagulls circling overhead. They're the only witnesses left to a day the sky went fishing, and the city below got stuck with the bill. Salt Lake City's skies had been behaving all morning on June 14, 2015, just another Bluebird Utah day with the Wasatch Mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Then, without warning, the heavens turned fickle. A peculiar sound rippled through the suburbs west of downtown, like someone shaking a massive bag of wet coins. Residents glanced up just in time to see the sidewalks shimmer not from heat, but from hundreds of flapping Utah chub fish, their olive-green bodies smacking onto driveways and ricocheting off mailboxes with a sound one teenager later described as nature's worst drum solo. This wasn't just another fish rain. Utah chub are the ultimate survivors, a species so hardy they've outlasted glaciers, droughts, and even the Great Salt Lake's rising salinity. Finding them airborne was like watching a cockroach learn to fly. It shouldn't be possible, yet here they were, bouncing off minivans with stubborn resilience. Scientists quickly traced their origin to nearby Willard Bay, a freshwater reservoir where chub thrive in such numbers they're considered invasive, the prevailing theory. A freak landspout, a weak land-borne tornado, had dipped into the bay's shallows, slurping up fish like a celestial slurpee before losing its grip over the suburbs. But here's where pioneer folklore elbows its way into the science. Mormon settlers who founded Salt Lake City in the 1840s told stories of fish storms, claiming Brigham Young himself once interpreted a sudden fish fall as divine providence during a hunger-scarred winter. Some old diaries even describe chub specifically, praising their oily flesh as manna from heaven's nets. Modern meteorologists might scoff at the supernatural spin, but the parallels are eerie. Both then and now, the fish arrived during drought years when shrinking lakes forced chub into dense, vulnerable shallows, perfect targets for rogue whirlwinds. The aftermath played out with equal parts pragmatism and poetry. Kids squealed as they tried to catch fish midair, while a local sushi chef, ever the opportunist, posted a sign reading, "Freshest catch in Utah," literally. Meanwhile, biologists seized the moment to study the chub's bizarre durability. Unlike most fish, which die quickly out of water, these were still flopping hours later, their gills somehow extracting oxygen from Utah's thin mountain air. One researcher marveled, "It's like they evolved to survive biblical plagues, including being dropped from the sky." For the Goshute and Shoshone tribes, the event carried deeper resonance. Oral histories speak of Parogo, the whirlwind spirit, who occasionally returns what the water takes. Some elders saw the chub rain as a reminder of nature's cyclical balance, especially poignant in a state where lakes vanish faster than legends. By sundown, Salt Lake City had embraced its latest oddity. Jokes about chubnado trended locally, while scientists quietly added Utah to a growing list of places where fish rains defy easy explanation. But the real lesson wasn't in the how, it was in the why. In a world of shrinking waters and shifting climates, perhaps these events aren't freak accidents at all. Maybe they're nature's way of redistributing its wealth, one airborne fish at a time. Or as one grinning fisherman put it while scraping chub off his truck bed, "Guess even the skies gotta throw some back." Denver's summer storms usually bring welcome relief from the heat, but on the afternoon of July 23, 2016, the clouds delivered something far stranger than rain. Residents near City Park first noticed an odd clicking sound hitting their rooftops like hailstones, but somehow crunchier. Then came the real surprise: crawdads. Dozens of them, each about the size of a toddler's fist, clattering onto sidewalks and bouncing off parked cars with their little claws still snapping defensively. One cyclist swore he saw a crawdad land perfectly in a pedestrian's open tote bag, its pincers waving indignantly as if demanding a refund for this unscheduled flight. Now, fish rains might be bizarre enough, but crustaceans, crawdads or crayfish, depending on where you're from, aren't exactly built for aerial acrobatics. These freshwater lobsters prefer muddy creek bottoms, clinging to rocks or burrowing into sediment. For them to end up airborne wasn't just unusual, it defied basic biology. Witnesses described them as still feisty, with some even trying to pinch fingers when picked up. the most baffling detail, Denver sits a mile above sea level, far from the crawdads' typical lowland habitats. The nearest populations lived in the South Platte River, over 5 miles southeast. So how did they end up falling onto bistro tables in Capitol Hill? Meteorologists pointed to an invisible culprit, high-altitude vortices. That afternoon, satellite imagery revealed a rare mountain wave phenomenon, a twisting current of air that forms when winds slam into the Rockies and get forced upward. These spirals can act like conveyor belts, lifting objects from lower elevations and carrying them for miles before losing momentum. One theory suggests the vortex dipped into a crawdad-rich pond or slow-moving stream, hoovering up the unlucky crustaceans before ascending to cruising altitude. But here's where physics throws a wrench in the theory. Crawdads are dense, much heavier than fish relative to their size. Lifting them would require winds strong enough to uproot trees, yet Denver's weather logs showed only moderate gusts that day. Then there's the altitude factor. Most fish rain cases happen near sea level, where thicker air makes it easier for whirlwinds to carry weight. At Denver's elevation, the air is thinner, meaning any vortex would need exponentially more power to lift the same mass. Some researchers floated the idea of a stacked draft, multiple small vortices working in unison like a bucket brigade, passing crawdads upward in stages. Others speculated the crayfish might have been lighter than usual, perhaps clinging to floating debris when the wind snatched them. Local biologists added another wrinkle: crawdad behavior. These creatures are notorious escape artists, capable of migrating overland during wet seasons. Could a group have been crawling en masse when the vortex hit, leaving them unusually exposed? It's a stretch, but then again, so is the idea of lobster rain in the first place. The event left even seasoned scientists shrugging, with one quipping, maybe the crawdads just really wanted to see the zoo. What made the Colorado crawdad cloud truly unforgettable, though, wasn't just the science, it was the aftermath. Unlike fish, which quickly suffocate out of water, crawdads can survive for days in damp conditions. For weeks afterward, Denverites reported finding stragglers in storm drains, flower pots, and even one particularly determined specimen scaling a fire escape. The city's Wildlife Rescue Center fielded calls from concerned citizens asking how to return sky crawdads to their natural habitat, while meme-savvy locals photoshopped the critters onto UFOs with captions like, "Denver's newest residents, not from around here." In the end, the event became more than a weather oddity. It was a testament to nature's relentless creativity. If a mile-high city can get pelted with freshwater lobsters, what other surreal surprises might be drifting in the jet stream? The answer, much like the crawdads themselves, remains just out of reach, snapping defiantly at the edges of our understanding. Jackson, Mississippi, had seen its share of strange summer storms, but nothing could prepare the city for the afternoon of August 9, 2017, when the sky turned into a juke joint and the rain sang the blues. It started with a thick, humid haze rolling in from the delta, the kind of air that makes guitar strings go slack and porch swings creak louder. Then came the sound, a rhythmic thumping like a bass drum dropped from a second-story window. But this wasn't just another thunderstorm tuning up. Mudfish, hundreds of them, their slimy brown bodies tumbling onto Beale Street's historic blues clubs with a sound one bartender described as the devil tuning his slide guitar. These weren't just any fish. Mississippi mudfish, or bowfin, as scientists call them, are living fossils, a species so ancient they swam alongside dinosaurs. Finding them on rooftops and neon-lit sidewalks was like stumbling into a time warp where the Cretaceous period had a residency at Ground Zero Blues Club. Witnesses swore some fish were still thrashing, their gaping mouths and jagged dorsal fins giving them the look of disgruntled swamp monsters rudely evicted from their bayous. The irony wasn't lost on locals. Mudfish are notoriously tough, capable of surviving out of water for days by gulping air. Watching them rain down felt like nature's twisted punchline. These fish had endured millennia, only to get drafted into a meteorological slapstick routine. Meteorologists traced the storm's path with forensic blues. A supercell had spun up near the Pearl River, its rotating winds dredging the shallows where mudfish lurk in weedy hideouts. But here's where the science hit a bottleneck. Mudfish are bottom dwellers, masters of camouflage who bury themselves in silt. For a tornado to yank them up, it would have needed to scrape the riverbed like a vengeful claw, an act usually reserved for hurricanes, not an afternoon squall. Even stranger, the fish fell in a tight corridor along Farish Street, the historic heart of Jackson's blues scene, as if the sky itself had a setlist to follow. Cue the legends. Within hours, local musicians were weaving the event into songs, turning biological absurdity into cultural gold. Bluesman Luther, Gator Tail, Johnson debuted Mudfish Fallen Like a Broken Chord at a smoky backroom gig that night, his slide guitar mimicking the fish's wobbly descent. The lyrics, "Sky done threw my supper down / but the Lord ain't give no tartar sauce," became an instant anthem. Meanwhile, a trio of teenage buskers near the old Alamo Theater coined "Swimmin' Upstream to Heaven," a gospel blues hybrid that imagined the fish as sinners getting spit back out by the River Jordan. Even the Mississippi Blues Trail added a cheeky marker years later. On this spot, the sky dropped the bass literally. Scientists, meanwhile, were left humming a different tune. The event challenged assumptions about how tornadoes interact with river ecosystems. Most fish rains involve surface-dwelling species, but mudfish, they're the river's secret keepers, lurking where light barely reaches. One hydrologist proposed the storm's suction might have triggered a substrate explosion, churning the riverbed so violently that even buried fish got ejected. Others pointed to the mudfish's swim bladders, unusually flexible organs that might have helped them survive the pressure changes mid-flight. But for Jackson's elders, the explanation was pure poetry. Blues culture was born from turning hardship into art, and here was Mother Nature herself sitting in on the tradition. As Miss Ida Mee, a 90-year-old juke joint regular, told the Clarion Ledger, "Ain't nothing new 'bout fish fallen." But them mudfish, they got stories in 'em older than my granddaddy's moonshine still. Maybe the sky just wanted somebody to listen. By midnight, the streets were strewn with fish and guitar picks, a surreal mosaic of scales and steel strings. Cleanup crews worked to the sound of harmonica wails drifting from open club doors, while biologists scrambled to preserve specimens not just for science but for history. Because in Mississippi, even the weather writes lyrics, and on that sticky August night, the clouds crooned a ballad so weird, so wonderfully inexplicable, that it didn't just belong to meteorology. It belonged to the blues. Dover, Delaware, was bracing for a nor'easter on the morning of March 12, 2018. The kind of coastal storm that whips sand into your teeth and sends patio furniture fleeing down the boardwalk. But as winds howled off the Atlantic, residents noticed something odd mixed with the horizontal rain. Not debris, not seaweed, flounder, dozens of them, their pancake-flat bodies cartwheeling through the air like discarded dinner plates, slapping onto parking lots and skidding across rain-slicked streets. One particularly unlucky flounder even smacked into a Wawa sign with enough force to leave a scale-shaped smear, a detail the store manager later described as the ocean's idea of abstract art. Now, fish rains are strange enough when they involve typical, upright swimming species, but flounder, these bottom dwellers are nature's living pancakes, evolved to hug the seafloor with both eyes peering up from one side of their heads. Watching them tumble from the sky felt like witnessing evolution's blueprint get crumpled up and tossed aside. Witnesses described the surreal sight of their speckled brown tops and creamy white undersides flashing alternately as they spun, a bizarre meteorological flipbook. Even more baffling, these weren't tiny juveniles. Some measured over 14 inches long, their muscular tails still twitching as they landed. scientists scrambled for explanations. The usual culprit, waterspouts, seemed unlikely. Flounder avoid surface waters where whirlwinds typically snatch prey, preferring to burrow into sand or mud. One marine biologist compared it to a tornado selectively plucking potatoes from the bottom of a field without disturbing the cornstalks. Weather radar added another wrinkle. The storm's strongest winds had been recorded nearly 30 miles offshore, far beyond Delaware Bay's flounder-rich shallows. So how did these flatfish end up as aerial projectiles? The most compelling theory involved an oceanic phenomenon called storm surge ejection. As the nor'easter's colossal waves pounded the continental shelf, they may have triggered underwater landslides along the sandy slope where flounder congregate. The resulting turbulence could have dislodged the fish en masse, while the storm's backdraft, a counterflow of wind rushing seaward, caught them mid-column and launched them inland like a biological slingshot. It's a process normally associated with scattering sediment, not relocating live fish. But as one climatologist noted, when a storm wants to play darts with sea creatures, physics becomes more of a suggestion than a rule. Locals, meanwhile, embraced the absurdity with classic Delmarva pragmatism. A group of surfers used stranded flounder as improvised snowboards on the drenched boardwalk, while a seafood truck parked near Legislative Hall posted a sign, "Sky Quarter Specials," literally. Yet beneath the laughs lurked a legitimate ecological concern. Flounder populations along the Atlantic had already been crashing due to overfishing. Finding them airborne raised uneasy questions. Had the storm scraped up a rare surviving cluster, or was this a freakish redistribution of a species on the brink? The event left meteorologists and marine biologists in rare agreement. Sometimes nature doesn't just break its own rules, it scribbles over them in permanent ink. Because if a storm can turn bottom-hugging flounder into temporary skydivers, what other oceanic secrets might be lurking in the next gale? The answer, much like the fish themselves, seems to be hiding in plain sight, just sideways and a lot harder to explain. Boise's summer of 2019 was already shaping up to be historic. Record heat had baked the Snake River into sluggishness, leaving its waters lower than locals had seen in decades. Then, on August 3rd, the weather decided to rewrite the rulebook entirely. It started with an eerie stillness, the kind that makes birds go quiet and dogs pace nervously. Then came the thunder, not from clouds but from impact. Dozens of white sturgeon, some stretching 6 feet long and weighing over 100 pounds, began crashing onto roads and rooftops across the city's north end like scaly meteorites. Witnesses described the sound as a car wreck in slow motion. As prehistoric-looking fish, their bony plates and shark-like tails, unmistakable, slammed into pavement with enough force to crack windshields. This wasn't just another fish rain. White sturgeon are living fossils, a species that's remained virtually unchanged since the time of dinosaurs, and in Idaho they're critically endangered. Finding them airborne wasn't just bizarre, it was biologically catastrophic. River biologists rushed to the scene, their horror growing as they identified the fish as adult spawners, individuals vital to the Snake River's dwindling population. One fisheries technician, voice shaking, told reporters, "This is like watching a museum's dinosaur skeleton get launched through a tornado." Theories about the how ranged from plausible to surreal. The leading explanation pointed to a freak hydraulic jump, a phenomenon where fast-moving river water collides with slower currents, creating a vertical surge powerful enough to eject debris. With the Snake River running so low that year, experts speculated that sturgeon, normally deep-dwelling, had been forced into unusually shallow channels, leaving them vulnerable to the river's sudden tantrum. Weather data revealed a microburst had struck the river's surface at the same moment, its downward force potentially turning the hydraulic jump into a biological cannon. But here's where the mystery deepens. Sturgeon are built like armored submarines, with thick, cartilage-reinforced bodies designed to withstand crushing depths. For river dynamics to literally throw them into the sky suggested forces beyond textbook hydrology. Some researchers whispered about the Kármán vortex street, a fluid dynamics principle where alternating swirls can, under extreme conditions, create lift. Could the river have briefly turned itself into a natural fish catapult? The aftermath was equal parts tragedy and dark comedy. Residents grappled with the surreal sight of sturgeon draped over fences like discarded rugs, while wildlife teams scrambled to salvage survivors. One homeowner famously discovered a sturgeon wedged nose first in his backyard grill, its tail flapping weakly, a scene that later inspired a local brewery's Sturgeon Surprise IPA. But beneath the gallows humor lay a sobering reality. With fewer than 1,000 adult white sturgeon left in the Snake River system, losing even a dozen to a freak weather event was a blow the population might not recover from. In the end, the Idaho sturgeon surprise became more than a meteorological oddity. It was a stark lesson in how climate extremes, in this case drought-altered river behavior, can collide with conservation crises in ways nobody anticipates. Because when endangered species start falling from the sky, it's not just the weather that's broken, it's the very balance of the ecosystems we're fighting to save. And in Boise that day, the sky didn't just rain fish, it rained a warning. Cleveland's lakefront in February 2020 wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that turns steel brittle and breath into ice crystals. But on the 6th, residents got more than just another polar vortex. As a snow squall barreled in off Lake Erie, something unusual flickered in the gust's silver flashes tumbling between snowflakes. Then came the splats, yellow perch, hundreds of them, their distinctive striped sides slick with ice as they smacked onto frozen sidewalks and skidded across parking lots like some demented seafood curling tournament. This wasn't just another odd weather event. Yellow perch are the backbone of Lake Erie's winter fishery, a species so vital to the local economy that their population swings make front-page news. Finding them airborne was like watching dollar bills flutter down from a blizzard, except these bills had fins and were rapidly freezing to car hoods. Witnesses described the surreal sight of perch landing tail first in snowbanks, their spiny dorsal fins poking up like tiny flags marking nature's bizarre treasure drop. One Uber driver swore he'd watched a perch slide perfectly down a windshield wiper blade, its gills still pulsing as if protesting this unscheduled departure from aquatic norms. Meteorologists quickly connected the dots to Lake Erie's notorious snowbelt microclimates. Unlike most lakes, Erie's shallow depth lets it freeze and thaw rapidly, creating temperature imbalances that spawn sudden, violent squalls. These aren't your average snowstorms, they're localized weather tantrums capable of whipping up 80-mile-per-hour winds in minutes. One theory suggests a squall's rotating updrafts acted like an underwater vacuum, skimming schools of perch from the lake's ice-edged shallows where they congregate to avoid colder depths. But here's where the science gets slippery. Perch are dense, bottom-hugging fish. Lifting them requires more force than typical waterspouts generate unless the squall hit during a rare vertical turnover, when churning waters bring bottom dwellers temporarily to the surface. The timing added another layer of weirdness. February is peak ice fishing season on Lake Erie, with thousands of shanties dotting the frozen expanse. Local anglers, already grumbling about slow catches, now faced the existential slap of watching their quarry fall from the sky instead of rising through holes in the ice. One charter captain, interviewed mid-perch cleanup, deadpanned, "Guess the fish got tired of waiting for us to drill," yet the event held darker implications. Lake Erie's perch populations had been declining for years, battered by invasive species and algae blooms. Finding them literally ripped from their habitat underscored the lake's fragility. Marine biologists noted the fallen perch were all juveniles, next year's spawners, raising concerns about compounding ecological damage. One researcher compared it to a bank robbery where the thieves only steal the seeds, not the cash. Cleveland, ever resilient, turned calamity into comedy. A downtown brewery launched Squall Perch IPA within days, while the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame briefly displayed a frozen perch on a velvet pillow as Lake Erie's most metal weather report. But beneath the jokes lingered a sobering truth. If winter squalls could pluck fish from the Great Lakes with such ease, what did that mean for an era of intensifying storms? The answer, much like the perch themselves, remained suspended between ice and sky, a glittering, finned warning from the depths below. Buffalo's winters are famous for lake-effect snow, those relentless, swirling dumps of powder that bury the city under feet of white. But on January 18, 2021, Mother Nature decided to switch up the recipe. The sky didn't just unleash snow, it unleashed fish. Specifically, herring, hundreds of them, their silver bodies glinting like frozen coins as they tumbled onto the streets of North Buffalo alongside the usual flurries. Witnesses described the surreal crunch underfoot, not from icy sidewalks, but from the brittle carcasses of Atlantic herring littering the pavement like some demented seafood garnish on winter's worst Sunday. Now, lake-effect snow occurs when cold air whips across warmer lake waters, grabbing moisture and dumping it inland as snow. But herring, these aren't surface-skimming fish. They're deep water schoolers, usually found far below where winds could reach. So how did they end up as icy projectiles in a residential neighborhood? Meteorologists traced the storm's path with growing fascination. That morning, a freak snow squall vortex, a kind of mini tornado that forms over frozen lakes, had drilled into Lake Erie's unusually thin ice cover near the Buffalo Harbor. The vortex's suction apparently punched through to open water below, where herring had congregated in dense winter shoals. The result, a column of wind strong enough to turn fish into frozen missiles, hurling them inland with the same force that usually churns out snowdrifts. The irony wasn't lost on locals. Lake-effect storms are Buffalo's trademark, but this was like the weather dialed up a prank call. One plow driver shoveling herring off his driveway told reporters, "I've seen the lake spit out snow, ice, even dead birds once." But fish, that's just showing off. Scientists, meanwhile, saw a troubling climate connection. Lake Erie's ice cover had been thinning for decades, making these kinds of breaches more likely. The herring hail wasn't just weird, it was a sign of the lake's growing instability, a watery shrug at the old rules of winter. For marine biologists, the event raised another question. Herring are crucial to Lake Erie's food web. Finding them airborne wasn't just odd, it was ecologically reckless. Each fish represented calories ripped from the bellies of walleye, perch, and migrating birds. One researcher grimly noted the herring were all juveniles, part of a fragile year class already struggling against invasive species. "It's like the lake coughed up its future," she said. Yet Buffalo being Buffalo, the city embraced the absurdity. Within hours, memes dubbed it the herring bomb cyclone, while a dive bar near Hurtle Avenue served blizzard bombers, beers with pickled herring skewers dangling over the rim. Even the National Weather Service's Buffalo office, usually stoic in its forecasts, couldn't resist tweeting, "Heavy snow mixed with the fish. Yeah, we're as confused as you are." But beneath the jokes lay a deeper truth. The Great Lakes aren't just changing, they're rewriting their own playbook. If warming waters can turn lake-effect snow into lake-effect sushi, what other surprises lurk in the shifting ice? The answer, much like those herring, remains up in the air, waiting for the next gust to bring it crashing down. Billings, Montana, was just another sleepy ranching town until the afternoon of June 5, 2022, when the sky decided to turn the entire valley into its personal fishing hole. It started with an unnatural hush, the kind of stillness that makes horses twitch their ears and dogs whine at the screen door. Then came the roar, not of thunder but of something far stranger, the sound of rushing water where no water should be. Ranchers near the Yellowstone River looked up just in time to see the impossible, a swirling column of mist and spray twisting down from the clouds, its base flickering with silver flashes. Within seconds, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Those weren't raindrops, they were trout. Rainbow and brown trout, some over 18 inches long, began hammering into the prairie like scaly artillery shells. One rancher, Tom Harkness, swore he watched a trout arc cleanly into his cattle trough with a splash that sent his Herefords bolting. "That damn fish looked just as surprised as my cows," he'd later tell the Billings Gazette. Another family found 7 trout flopping in their empty horse trailer, their gills flaring like they were demanding someone turn the river back on. The most surreal account came from a group of teenage ranch hands who'd been fixing fence lines. They described the fish hitting the dry earth so hard that dust plumed up around each impact as if the ground itself was coughing. Scientists scrambled to explain the trout tornado, as locals quickly dubbed it. The Yellowstone River had been running high that spring, swollen with snowmelt, its banks teeming with spawning trout. Weather radar revealed a rare landspout, a weak, land-borne tornado, had formed directly over a bend in the river where fish clustered in the shallows. Normally, tornadoes over waterspouts, lose strength quickly, but this one had somehow intensified as it crossed the river, its suction powerful enough to dredge fish from depths of over 6 feet. The real mystery: trout are strong swimmers. For the whirlwind to pluck them against their instinct to dive deeper suggested forces beyond typical tornado physics. Biologists studying the fallen fish made an even stranger discovery. These trout weren't just any fish, they were all ripe spawners, their bodies packed with eggs and milk. One theory posited that the tornado had hit during the peak of their spawning ritual, when trout congregate tightly in riffles, making them vulnerable to a sudden upward yank. But ranchers along the river added another layer to the lore. Old-timers whispered about the Yellowstone's ghost spawn, a local legend claiming the river occasionally returns what it takes after flash floods. Was the trout rain some twisted fulfillment of that myth? The aftermath played out with equal parts pragmatism and poetry. Ranch wives baked trout en papillote with herbs from their gardens, while fly fishermen, initially outraged at the ecological disruption, quietly pocketed a few sky-gifted specimens for their smokers. Wildlife officials, meanwhile, faced a grim calculus. The Yellowstone's trout populations had already been hammered by whirling disease and warming waters. Losing even a single spawning cohort to a meteorological kidnapping could spell disaster. But the real legacy of Montana's trout tornado wasn't in the science or the survival stories. It was in the way it forced a reckoning with nature's whims. If a landspout could rewrite the rules of river ecology in 30 seconds, what else might the skies be capable of? As one grizzled fly fishing guide put it while grilling a rain-caught brown trout, "We spend our lives trying to outsmart fish. Turns out the sky's better at it than any of us." Houston's summer storms are legendary for their intensity, but no one expected the one on July 12, 2023 to rewrite the rulebook on bizarre weather. As floodwaters rose across the city's bayous, social media feeds lit up with something far stranger than the usual submerged highway videos. Gator gar, massive, armor-plated fish straight out of the Cretaceous period, began slamming onto rooftops and parking lots like nature's own Jurassic Park sequel. Witnesses described the sound as a grocery bag full of bowling balls hitting concrete, followed by the surreal sight of these needle-toothed giants, some over 6 feet long, thrashing in suburban driveways with primordial fury. The frenzy exploded faster than the storm itself. TikTok clips showed a gator gar smashing through a gazebo in Memorial Park, its crocodilian snout embedded in the splintered wood like some DIY fossil exhibit. Another video captured a Houston Fire Department battalion chief prying a 4-footer off a sedan's hood, muttering, "I signed up for fires, not dinosaur fish duty." Local news stations, never ones to miss a ratings goldmine, ran chyrons like gargoyles reign over Houston, while meme factories Photoshop the fish onto Weather Channel radar maps with captions like "Storm System Upgraded to T-Wrapped." But beneath the viral chaos lay a genuine biological mystery. Gator gar aren't just any fish, they're air-breathing, river-monitoring relics that survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Finding them airborne wasn't just unusual, it was like watching a stegosaurus crash land in a Walmart parking lot. Scientists traced the event to the Buffalo Bayou's swollen waters, where gar had been forced from their usual deep channels into flooded streets. The leading theory, a microburst, a sudden downward wind explosion, had essentially turned the bayou into a Slurpee machine, sucking up fish and water before dumping both inland. Yet the details defied logic. Gator gar weigh up to 200 pounds. Lifting them requires forces typically reserved for tornadoes, yet the storm never spun up beyond severe thunderstorm status. Marine biologists noted another oddity. The fallen gar were all adults, their bony scales barely scratched despite the fall. One researcher speculated their swim bladders, modified to gulp air, might have acted like built-in parachutes, slowing their descent. "It's like they evolved for this exact scenario," she told the Houston Chronicle, half joking. Maybe they wanted to see what life was like on land for a change. The social media circus reached peak absurdity when a local brewery launched Garfugo IPA, with a label featuring a gar wearing sunglasses mid-freefall, while conspiracy theorists insisted the fish were government-engineered stormtroopers. Never mind that gar have been patrolling Texas rivers for 80 million years, but for ecologists the event carried a sobering subtext. Buffalo Bayou's gar population had only recently rebounded after decades of overfishing. Finding them flung across the city underscored how climate-amplified storms could disrupt even the hardiest species. As cleanup crews hauled away the last gar, some donated to museums, others returned to the bayou by bemused wildlife officers, Houston was left with a new benchmark for weird weather. Not just because the sky had rained prehistoric predators, but because for one chaotic afternoon, the line between paleontology and meteorology had blurred into something straight out of a sci-fi novel. And if a storm could turn a 200-million-year-old survival specialist into a temporary skydiver, what other evolutionary surprises might be lurking in the next flood? The answer, much like the gar's toothy grin, seemed to say, "You ain't seen nothing yet." San Diego's coastline had seen its share of strange marine events: red tides, bioluminescent waves, even the occasional lost sea lion pup wandering onto a golf course. But nothing prepared the city for the morning of March 8, 2024, when the Pacific Ocean seemingly decided to return every flying fish it had ever borrowed. The chaos began just past dawn, as surfers paddling out at La Jolla shores noticed an odd shimmer above the waves, not sunlight on water, but hundreds of silver-blue bodies soaring through the air. At first, they assumed it was a massive school of flying fish, those ocean acrobats capable of gliding 50 yards on wing like fins. Then the fish kept going. And going until they weren't gliding anymore, they were falling. The scene quickly turned surreal. Flying fish, real name Oddities, from the Greek for sleeping outside, are evolutionary marvels, built to escape predators by launching themselves above the waves. But this wasn't escape, this was abduction. Fish slammed into beach umbrellas with enough force to puncture the fabric. They ricocheted off paddleboards like misplaced javelins. One lifeguard tower took a direct hit, its window cracked by a 6-inch missile with fins. The most baffling detail, these fish weren't just landing near the shore, they were raining down over a mile inland, peppering rooftops in Bird Rock, and even smacking into a sushi restaurant's sidewalk chalkboard, a twist of irony not lost on the chef, who later quipped, "I appreciate the delivery, but next time maybe use a cooler." Scientists scrambled for explanations. Flying fish typically skim the surface, using updrafts from waves to extend their leaps. for winds to carry them inland suggested something far more violent. Meteorologists pinpointed a rogue marine derecho, a straight-line windstorm that had raced up the Baja coast overnight, its gusts hitting 90 miles per hour. Normally, such winds would scatter surface foam or seabirds, but this derecho had apparently encountered a once-in-a-generation flying fish megaschool, their sheer numbers turning them into living confetti caught in the storm's grip. Marine biologists confirmed the fish were Pacific flying fish, a species known to aggregate in groups of thousands during spawning season. Timing, it seemed, had turned a natural behavior into a meteorological spectacle. But beneath the spectacle lurked a darker question. Was climate change rewriting the rules of fish rains? Researchers noted that warmer ocean temperatures had pushed flying fish populations northward in recent years, while intensified wind patterns linked to shifting pressure systems made extreme marine weather events more frequent. One oceanographer compared it to loading a circus cannon with more clowns and then lighting a bigger fuse. The math was sobering. If warmer waters meant denser fish schools and stronger winds meant greater transport capacity, events like San Diego's flying fish frenzy might shift from flukes to forecast. Locals, meanwhile, turned chaos into comedy. Surfers donned bike helmets for their dawn patrols, while a craft brewery in Pacific Beach released a limited edition Ariel IPA with a label featuring fish wearing parachutes. Yet for all the laughs, the event left scientists uneasy. Flying fish are a keystone species. Their aerial escapes a critical link in the food web. If storms started plucking them from the ocean en masse, what did that mean for the predators that relied on them, or the ecosystems they helped balance? The answer, much like the fish themselves, seemed suspended between sea and sky, a glinting, fleeting mystery. And as San Diego's cleanup crews scraped scales off sidewalks, one thing became clear. In a world where the weather could turn flying fish into falling hazards, even the ocean's oldest escape artists weren't safe from the sky's new whims. From gator gar crashing through Houston gazebos to prehistoric sturgeon bombing boys' backyards, these fish rain stories prove nature doesn't just break the rules, it sets them on fire and tosses them into a tornado. Think about it, swordfish spearing Miami beaches like airborne harpoons, goldfish plopping into Louisville coffee cups with looks of pure betrayal, even jellyfish shattering onto Seattle sidewalks like living stained glass. Each event is a reminder that the line between meteorology and mythology is thinner than a minnow's whisker. Scientists will tell you most fish rains boil down to waterspouts, those oceanic tornadoes that vacuum up anything unlucky enough to swim near the surface. But that doesn't explain the eerie precision of some events. Why did Selma's crappie target a school playground like a scaly drone strike? How did Denver's crawdad survive a mile-high joyride with their pincers still snapping? And what twisted physics lesson sent flounder cartwheeling through Dover like skipping stones flung by a giant? The truth is, even the best theories crumble under scrutiny like a sun-dried sardine. Tornadoes can't explain why only one species falls at a time, or how bottom dwellers get plucked from depths where winds shouldn't reach. Maybe that's the real magic of these events. They force us to confront how little we truly understand about the invisible highways between sea and sky. So here's your invitation to the weirdest weather club on Earth. Ever seen frogs rain down like squishy hail? Witnessed a shower of something that definitely didn't belong in your backyard? Drop your story below, because the next time the sky opens up, it might not be water falling. It could be catfish or koi or something even science hasn't named yet. And if you're craving more tales where nature laughs in the face of logic, hit that subscribe button. Trust us, the forecast calls for bizarre, and we're just getting started.